Jon kept mostly to himself, speaking only when needed. He trained by torchlight. He wrote letters to Arya and Sansa, not knowing if they'd ever reach them. Ghost scouted at night, returning with fresh blood on his white fur more than once. Then came the first real taste of war, the Battle of the Whispering Wood. It was here that Jon proved he was not just some bastard with a sword. He fought beside Robb in the trees, moving like a shadow, cutting down Lannister scouts before they could alert Jaime's camp. He killed a knight in full plate by driving his sword between the gaps in the gorget, not with rage, but precision. Ghost tore out the throat of a bannerman who had almost caught Robb unaware. By dawn, Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer himself, was bound in chains. When Robb rode through the remains of the Lannister camp, bloodied and victorious, the men cheered, "The King in the North." For the first time, Jon didn't join them. He stood silent at the edge of the camp, watching the defeated lion as he knelt in the mud. Jaime met Jon's eyes and smirked. "Still just a snow, aren't you?" Jon didn't respond. He didn't need to, because even Jaime saw it, the way the men looked at him, the way Robb trusted him. Jon Snow, the bastard who should have been forgotten, was becoming something dangerous. But war wasn't glory. It was blood, rot, and broken bones. Jon saw children without fathers, villages reduced to ash, and men screaming for their mothers as they bled out in snow-covered ditches. He began to carry a second dagger, always at his side, and started sleeping in his boots, not out of habit, but instinct. And then came the Raven. It came from the wall. Benjen Stark was declared missing. Rangers were dying. Wildlings were moving. And there were rumors, whispers, of things beyond the wall that should not walk. Jon read the letter twice, his hands trembling. He'd always known something was stirring beyond the frost, but now it was real. The world had split open, and while the South played its Game of Thrones, death was gathering in the North. He showed the letter to Robb. "Benjen's gone," Robb said quietly. "You would have been with him," Jon nodded. "I know." He looked northward that night, not toward the Lannisters, not toward King's Landing, but beyond the wall, beyond the cold. He dreamed of ice, of blue eyes in the dark, and of whispers carried on winds that spoke of kings and bastards and the dead who would not rest. But still, Jon did not regret staying, not yet, because he didn't know that Arya had vanished. He didn't know that Sansa was prisoner to a boy king with madness in his blood. He didn't know that Ned Stark would not live to see winter. And he didn't know that soon the North would bleed more than it ever had, and he would be forced to choose, brother or king, vengeance or fate. The Raven from King's Landing arrived at dawn. The sky was clear, the wind still. Jon didn't need to read the letter. He felt it in the air, a silence too deep, a stillness that settled over the camp like mourning. When Robb opened the scroll, his hands froze, his lips parted, but no words came. His eyes stared through the parchment like it had burned a hole in his soul. Jon stepped forward. "What is it?" Robb swallowed hard, jaw clenched. His voice cracked. "They executed him." The words crashed through Jon like a hammer. Ned Stark, beheaded by order of King Joffrey. In front of Sansa, in front of the crowd. Like a traitor. Jon didn't speak. He didn't scream. He just walked away from the fire, from the camp, from the sound of men cursing and shouting and scrambling to prepare for war. Ghost followed close behind, silent as ever, but even the direwolf's steps seemed heavier now. In the woods, Jon collapsed to his knees. The snow soaked through his trousers. He didn't feel the cold. He wasn't a true son of Ned Stark, not in name, not in blood, not in the eyes of the world, but he had lived as one. He had believed it. He had carried it in his bones. Now it felt like someone had ripped the last part of him away and left a hollow shell in its place. He thought of Arya, of Sansa, trapped, alone, helpless. He thought of Catelyn and how this would break her. He thought of Robb, now truly a king without a father to guide him. And he thought of vengeance. By the time Jon returned to the camp, his eyes were clear and his expression cold. He found Robb surrounded by lords, Great Jon Umber, Rose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, all shouting, demanding blood, demanding war. But John didn't speak until the rest had left. Robb looked up at him like a man who hadn't slept in years. "We ride to King's Landing," Robb said quietly. "We burn that throne to ash." John sat beside him. "And what happens when we win?" Robb's stare turned to steel. "We take back our sisters. We end the Lannisters, every last one. And then—" Robb blinked. "What do you mean?" John looked away. "There's more going on than you know. Beyond the wall. I've seen it in my dreams. Ghost feels it. Something's coming. Something worse than Lannisters. You think I care about old ghost stories now?" Robb's voice was sharp. "They murdered our father." John didn't argue, not yet. But the war he felt coming, it wasn't one of crowns. 2 days later, a scout returned. A small force of Lannisters had been spotted heading north, burning villages and hunting down any house loyal to the Starks. Among them rode Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, a monster in armor who left blood wherever he went. Robb sent out riders to intercept, but John asked for command. "You're not a lord," Rose Bolton said coldly. "You have no title, no banner, no—" "He's a Stark in all but name," Robb cut in. "And he fights better than half our men." They gave John 30 riders and a moonless night. They didn't expect him to return, but he did. At dawn, he came back dragging 2 prisoners and 3 severed heads. His cloak was torn, his face smeared with blood, and Ghost's muzzle dripped red. The Lannister raiders were gone, torn apart in the woods. None had escaped. Robb met him at the edge of camp, stunned. "You tracked them in the dark." John nodded. "We knew the land better. They were drunk on blood and gold. They didn't think a bastard would hunt them." From that moment forward, the whispers changed. He wasn't just the snow anymore. He was the White Wolf. The men began following him, not because of his name, but because of his fury, because he killed without hesitation, because he spoke little, but led from the front. And when men stood beside him, they survived. Still, John didn't chase glory. Every step forward was just a distraction from the storm building in his chest, the one he couldn't shake, the one that whispered, "You're not done here. This is not your war." And then, one night, a second raven came. It wasn't from King's Landing. It wasn't from the north. It was from Castle Black, a short letter, scrawled in a trembling hand. Benjen never returned. "The dead walk. They come at night. We are dying." John read it 3 times, then folded it quietly. He didn't sleep that night, because he knew the war in the south meant nothing. Not if the north fell to the dead. The fire crackled low in the command tent. Robb sat at the head of the table, eyes locked on the map of the Riverlands, his fingers resting on a carved direwolf. Lords argued around him. Some called for a march on Harrenhal. Others urged him to strike at Tywin Lannister before he could regroup. But John stood silent, the letter from Castle Black burning a hole in his thoughts. He could hear the words again and again. "The dead walk. They come at night. We are dying." He waited until the last of the lords were gone. Only Robb remained, hunched over the map, like the weight of the north itself rested on his shoulders. John stepped forward. "I need to go." Robb looked up, confused. "Where?" "North," John said, voice flat. "To the wall, to Castle Black." Robb frowned. "That's hundreds of leagues behind us. Why now?" John slid the letter across the table. Robb read it, and his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something close to fear. "This could be a trick," Robb said. "Meant to draw men away. Meant to make us scatter." John shook his head. "No, I know it's real." Robb stood. "John, if you leave now, you're walking away from everything. We need you. I need you." "I know," John said quietly. "But if what this letter says is true, then none of this matters. Not your war. Not the Lannisters. Not the Iron Throne. None of it." Silence stretched between them. Brothers, raised in the same halls, trained by the same master-at-arms, standing on the edge of 2 very different paths. "If you go," Robb said, "you might not come back." John gave a half-smile. "If I stay, I might not either." Robb didn't argue again. He walked around the table and pulled John into a hug, one that lasted longer than it should have, like he already knew this was a goodbye they wouldn't get to repeat. The next morning, John rode out before sunrise. Alone, save for Ghost, no fanfare. No banners. Just a bastard on a black horse, riding into frost and silence. The journey back to the wall was cold and merciless. The north was no longer peaceful. Villages had been abandoned. Smoke rose from distant farms, and roads were littered with signs of chaos, broken carts, burnt homes, and the occasional corpse half buried in snow. But it wasn't bandits John feared. It was the silence. The air itself felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. He passed through Last Hearth, where House Umber had once ruled. The gates were open. No guards, no voices. Just the creak of old wood and the crunch of snow underfoot. He dismounted and walked through the yard, Ghost stalking beside him, tense and growling. There was blood on the walls. A streak down the steps. Blood on the walls. A streak down the steps. The snow was falling hard on Winterfell, muffling the sounds of the world like a thick white blanket of silence. Jon Snow stood alone in the Godswood, Ghost at his side, watching the flakes melt on the red leaves of the weirwood tree. He was supposed to leave at first light for the wall, to take the Black, to join the Night's Watch, to give up any chance of land, title, or a name. But his mind wouldn't let him go. That night he didn't sleep. Something inside twisted and refused to settle. Not fear, but something colder. Resentment, bitterness, maybe even a bit of that stark stubbornness he had inherited from the man he still believed to be his father. As dawn painted the sky a dull grey, Jon didn't pack. He stood by the stables, cloak pulled tight, Ghost pacing nervously beside him. He watched Benjen Stark ride out alone. He watched the gates close, and he stayed. When Robb found him later, still standing there, face pale and expression unreadable, the young wolf stopped in his tracks. "You didn't go," Robb said. Jon shook his head once. "No." At first, no one knew what to make of it. Catelyn's disapproval was sharp and immediate. She barely looked at Jon, barely tolerated his presence in the halls. Lord Stark didn't say much, only that Jon was now a man, and his decisions would carry weight. Sansa and Arya whispered, and even little Bran asked what had happened. But Jon had changed something. Something big. A raven arrived not long after. News of King Robert's coming. Ned was to become Hand of the King. In another life, Jon would have been gone by then. But not in this one. In this life, Jon sat at the high table when the royal procession thundered into the courtyard. He watched Robert embrace Ned, drunk and bloated, laughing like he didn't carry the weight of a dying kingdom on his shoulders. Jon stood in the shadows, not part of it, but present. Cersei's eyes found him across the great hall. A bastard, she had been told, but something about the way he held himself, the way his direwolf followed his every step, made her uneasy. He had the look of a Stark, but there was something else. Something not northern at all. Tyrion Lannister, however, was intrigued. You didn't join the watch. The imp asked, sipping his wine beside the fire that evening. Smart boy. Miserable place, the wall. Cold, boring, and full of criminals who can't even hold a sword properly. Jon only nodded. He didn't trust the man yet, but he was curious. Tyrion seemed to know too much, and spoke like he saw right through people. You've started a storm, you know, Tyrion added, swirling his goblet. Ned Stark's bastard refusing the wall. People talk, especially the Queen. Jon's jaw tightened. Let them talk. But talk did spread. Whispers of Jon's presence at Winterfell made it to ears that shouldn't have cared. Varys heard, so did Littlefinger. Because if Jon Snow wasn't a sworn brother, if he was still in Winterfell, if he still had a claim to something, then everything could change. And then Ned took Sansa and Arya south. That night, Jon stood in the courtyard again, watching the procession vanish into the tree line. He felt the ache of being left behind, but not the regret. He was meant to stay. He felt it in his bones. Robb became the acting lord of Winterfell, but he was still more boy than man. Jon began training the younger guards. He took more meals with Maester Luwin, learning how to read maps, histories, and letters of war. He hunted with Theon, though their conversations turned colder each week. And he grew close to Arya, now lost in King's Landing, through the letters they exchanged. She missed him deeply. But something darker brewed in Jon, just beneath the surface. A feeling that he had walked off the map, that this world, without the Watch, without the Wall, without the Oath, was unwritten. And one night, when Ghost started growling at the wind, John stood outside and felt it too. Something was coming. From the north, past the wall, something ancient, something cold. But this time, he wasn't at the wall to see it. The winter winds howled louder with each passing night, and though the snows had not yet swallowed the north, Winterfell had begun to feel uneasy. John started waking up to Ghost, snarling in his sleep. The direwolf paced the halls at night, always facing north, ears perked, as if waiting for something to arrive. Something not quite human. John spoke to Maester Lewin about it once. "There's no proof of anything beyond the wall, but wildlings and old stories," Lewin said kindly, though his voice lacked conviction. The watch would have sent word if something were wrong. But John knew better. He hadn't taken the black, but he still felt the pull of the wall like a voice in the distance, faint, desperate, but real. And more than that, he felt guilt. Not the kind that gnaws at you softly, but the kind that crushes your chest in silence. Every time he thought of Benjen, every time he looked northward, he felt it. He should have been there. And yet, something had kept him in Winterfell. Something that hadn't finished with him yet. Robb had begun to take his duties more seriously. The war horns hadn't sounded yet, but every raven that came from the south spoke of politics, of tension, of kings and wolves. John watched his brother grow into command, firm, proud, but still uncertain. They trained together most mornings, though the sparring had become more serious. No more laughter, just sweat, bruises, and long silences. "You ever think you should have gone?" Robb asked once mid-swing. John blocked with his sword, breathing hard. "Sometimes. You'd have been Lord Commander within 10 years. John gave a bitter smile. "Or dead within 1. But Robb wasn't joking. He knew John was sharper, faster, and more disciplined than most men twice his age. There was something about John that felt different, not just because he was a Snow, because he was always watching, always preparing for something he hadn't yet named. Then came the letter, sealed in Baratheon gold, sent from King's Landing, carried by a black-feathered raven. Ned Stark had been imprisoned, accused of treason. The entire hall fell into silence as Robb read it aloud. Catelyn had returned to Winterfell only a week prior, her face still drawn from the road, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her husband had been sent into a nest of vipers. Now the snake had struck. Jon clenched his fists beneath the table. Treason, Ned Stark? They all knew what this meant. War was not a possibility, it was a certainty. The Lannisters had declared open defiance, and King Robert was dead. The boy Joffrey sat on the throne, his mother ruling through him, and Ned, who had honored Robert's final wishes, now rotted in a dungeon. "I'll march south," Robb said, standing. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned. "I'll call the banners." The north would rise. Jon could feel it in the very stones beneath his feet. But he wasn't sworn to anything. No black cloak, no vows, no duties that would chain him to the wall. He was still free. And that made him dangerous. Robb looked to him that night as the fires crackled and plans were drawn. "You don't have to come," Robb said. "You're not sworn. You owe no one anything." But Jon didn't flinch. "I'm your brother. I ride with you." The decision sent a quiet ripple through Winterfell. Jon Snow would ride to war, not as a bastard left behind, but as a sword beside the young wolf. Some respected it. Others questioned it. And one person, Theon Greyjoy, despised it. "He gets to be part of the family now." Theon spat later, half drunk, half jealous. He says, "I ride with you," and suddenly he's not a Snow anymore? Jon ignored him. Ghost didn't. That night, as preparations for war stirred the castle, Jon climbed the highest tower and looked out toward the darkening forests. The wall was far beyond the horizon, but he could feel it. Something had shifted in the world, and Jon Snow had not yet met the fate the gods had written for him. Maybe he wasn't meant to be a watcher on the wall. Maybe he was meant to be something else entirely. Shall we continue with part 3? Things are about to explode. You said, "Yes, stories," writer by Amar said, "The North rode to war under a sky thick with crows. Snow flurries danced on the cold wind, as bannermen from every corner of the North gathered beneath the Stark banner. Jon stood among them, no longer just the bastard of Winterfell, but a seasoned rider with a direwolf at his side and the eyes of soldiers watching him like he was more than he claimed to be. He wore no armor of silver or gold. His breastplate was simple black, his cloak fur-lined and worn. Ghost walked beside his horse like a silent shadow, pale as death. Whispers traveled ahead of them. The bastard rides. The white wolf walks. Some feared him. Some followed him. And when Robb stood before the host of the North, declaring that he would bring justice to the Lannisters, Jon stood at his right. Catelyn barely spoke to Jon during those early days of the march. Her gaze was sharp, her pain too fresh. She had not forgotten that Jon's blood wasn't her own, and that her true-born husband rotted in a southern cell, while the boy she barely tolerated now held a sword for her son. But even she couldn't deny Jon's presence had weight. They rode hard. Robb's army moved faster than the southern lords expected. With every village they passed, more men joined. The stories of Ned's imprisonment and Joffrey's madness fanned the flames of rebellion like a storm wind. No bodies. Jon left that place without looking back. When he finally reached the wall, it stood as massive and unforgiving as ever, a wall of ice so tall it swallowed the sky. But Castle Black, it was dying. He rode through the gate unchallenged. Inside, he found barely 24 men left. Some wounded, some too scared to speak. Others drunk or half-mad. They looked at him like a ghost, someone who should have never returned. A grizzled old ranger approached. "You're Stark's boy. Thought you were off playing war. I need to speak to whoever's still alive and sane," Jon said. "Now." The man led him to the top of the wall. It was worse than Jon imagined. Far north in the distance, something stirred in the trees. Not movement exactly, but an absence, a darkness, a presence that pressed on the senses like a scream behind glass. Ghost whimpered, hair standing up along his spine. Jon stood at the edge, eyes narrowed. His breath fogged the air. His heart beat slow and heavy. And then he saw it. A figure, pale, not walking, gliding. It looked up. Its eyes were blue, not just bright, unnatural, cold fire. The kind of blue that didn't belong in this world. Jon didn't flinch. He stared right back. The wind howled between them. He whispered to himself, "This is real." And in that moment, Jon Snow understood something no lord in the south ever would. The real war had never been for the throne. It had always been for the living. The cold at Castle Black was no longer just a matter of weather. It was something else now. It sank into the bones of the place, into the stones, into the men. Jon walked among shadows, brothers of the Night's Watch who barely looked like men anymore. Some still held swords, but most held only fear. Fear of the night, fear of the woods, fear of what used to be men, now crawling through the frost like death wearing familiar faces. The wall hadn't fallen, but the watch had. Jon spent the first night in the Lord Commander's chambers. Mormont was gone, killed beyond the wall on a ranging gone wrong. Most of the senior officers were dead or missing. There was no order here anymore, just survival. He sat alone, poring over old maps, records, and scraps of messages from lost rangers. He wasn't a commander. He wasn't even a sworn brother. But the weight still landed on his shoulders like a crown of ice. A knock came at the door near midnight. One of the surviving stewards, a boy no older than Bran, stood in the doorway shivering. "There's a rider," the boy said. "From the Shadow Tower, says he saw something." Jon followed him through the frozen halls, his hand never far from his sword. When he reached the courtyard, the rider stood slumped over his saddle, half frozen and bleeding from a wound that looked like it hadn't bled right. Jon helped him down himself. The man's voice was broken when he spoke. "They don't die, right? You burn them or they get back up. Even their shadows walk after them." Jon's heart beat slow and hard. "How far south?" The man coughed blood. "They've crossed the gorge, at least 24. Could be more." Jon knew what that meant. They were already past the wall. The next morning he stood before what remained of the Night's Watch, 24 men, most barely standing. Some were no more than boys, others too old to fight. None had hope in their eyes. He looked at them, really looked, and he spoke. "Your vows are broken. Your brothers are dead. Your commanders are gone. Silence. He stepped forward, Ghost pacing beside him. You're not men of the watch anymore, he said. You're the last line between the living and the dead. So either you pick up your swords again and fight like your lives mean something, or you'll die cold, forgotten, and worse. You'll rise as one of them, someone laughed bitterly. A grizzled man with frost-bitten fingers. And who the fuck are you to give orders, bastard? John looked him dead in the eyes. I'm the one who came back. There was no cheer, no great rally, just a quiet, grim understanding. They sharpened their blades that night. They reinforced the gates. They built fires high and wide enough to burn a forest, and John prepared for something none of them were ready for. 3 nights later they came, not as a charge, not as an army. They drifted from the woods like fog, silent, relentless, cold. John stood on the wall watching as they emerged. Not hundreds, not yet, but enough to know the stories were true. Corpses that moved, eyes glowing blue, flesh stiff and torn. Some were wildlings, some wore bits of old black cloaks. All were dead. The men at Castle Black were still. The fear was suffocating. And then John drew his sword, Long Claw, the Valyrian steel blade Mormont had once meant to give him after his oath. He took it anyway now. There were no oaths left. They're not men, he said to the boy beside him. They don't feel fear, but they burn, and they bleed when cut deep. Can they be killed? The boy asked, shaking. John looked down at the sword. We'll find out. He rode down to the courtyard. He didn't wait for them to breach the gates. He opened them. Ghost was the first to leap. John followed, sword raised, and fire followed them. What happened that night would not make it into the histories. There were no lords to witness it, no meisters to write it down. But when the sun rose, pale and cold, John stood amidst the charred remains of corpses that no longer moved. Only 10 men had survived, but Castle Black had not fallen, not yet. And in the frost-covered field beyond the wall, something watched him. Not a wight, something older, something colder. A figure on a pale horse, eyes like ice, crown of frost. The Night King, and John knew this wasn't a victory. It was an invitation. John didn't sleep after that night. Not because of the battle. That was done. The fire still smoldered in the fields, the smoke curling skyward like black fingers, clawing at the clouds. The dead were truly dead this time, burned to ash or hacked to pieces. Ghost paced the wall restlessly, ears twitching, growling into the dark. But John's mind was elsewhere. It was that look, those eyes. The Night King hadn't attacked. He hadn't raised a hand or spoken a word. He had simply watched, calm and still, as if waiting, as if measuring something. And that meant only one thing. It wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. John stood at the top of the wall that morning, wind biting through his furs, watching the northern horizon. The snow never stopped now, not completely. The world felt like it was being slowly buried. The steward boy, Tom, brought him something wrapped in cloth. We found it on one of the dead, he said, handing it over with trembling hands. You should see it. John unwrapped it, a piece of bone-white obsidian, dragon glass, and beside it, a scrap of dark blue cloth embroidered with the sigil of House Stark. He stared at it for a long time. Where? He asked. On a corpse near the trees. Looked like a ranger, maybe one of yours. John didn't speak. He didn't have to. The next day, the raven came. Not from the wall, not from Winterfell, but from Dragonstone. A single piece of parchment, sealed with black wax. The sigil was a 3-headed dragon. The message, short and strange. You are not what you believe you are. Fire belongs to you as much as ice. Come to me, Daenerys Targaryen. John stared at the letter like it might catch fire in his hands. He didn't know how she knew. He didn't know how she'd even heard of him. But the words echoed something that had long haunted his sleep. Fire and ice, he looked at Ghost. The direwolf whined softly, almost like he felt it too, that shift in the air, that pull towards something distant and dangerous. He walked through Castle Black in silence, listening to the dying men cough, the creak of ice settling in the walls, the emptiness echoing between towers. These men had done their part. They had fought. But the wall couldn't hold forever, not against what Jon had seen. He gathered what remained of the obsidian. Dragonglass, death to the dead. He sharpened it himself, his hands steady. He forged new weapons, trained the remaining men in silence. But inside something was changing. He was done waiting. That night, he went back to the crypt beneath Castle Black, an old place, forgotten and cold. He stood alone before a sealed door. Behind it was an object few in the realm knew existed. A sword of pure black steel, lighter than steel, stronger than iron, touched by fire, touched by magic. It wasn't Longclaw. It was older. When he touched it, the steel burned hot in his palm, not painfully, but as if it knew him, as if it had waited for him. The fire didn't harm him. Ghost backed away, eyes wide. Jon's eyes flickered in the dark. For a moment, just a breath, they flashed with something unnatural. Not blue, but gold. A dragon's flame. And just like that, it vanished. He sheathed the sword. He looked north once more. And then he left. He rode alone again, but not as a bastard. Not as a Stark, and not as a man sworn to anything. He rode as someone who had no place, but a purpose. He rode through frozen villages and haunted woods. He crossed paths with wildlings, some who fled from him, some who bowed. He didn't stop for any of them, because something had begun to awaken inside him. Something old, something powerful. He had always been drawn to the snow, but now he could feel the heat in his blood too, like a spark waiting for flame. And far across the narrow sea, a queen with dragons was dreaming of fire and war and a man she had never met. Yet somehow, already knew, the shores of Dragonstone were black and jagged, cut by wind and sea and time. When Jon arrived, the sky was ash-grey, clouds low and swirling with the scent of rain. Ghost didn't leave his side. Clouds low and swirling with the scent of rain. Ghost didn't leave his side. He stood like a guardian carved from bone, white fur stark against the dark rocks. They were met by unsullied, silent, disciplined, eyes unreadable. Jon gave up his weapons without hesitation. He came not as a conqueror nor a knight. He came as a warning. He was brought through stone halls lit with fire, banners of red dragons rippling in the breeze. He passed men who looked at him with curiosity, servants who whispered about the direwolf, and advisors who watched him like he was a riddle they weren't ready to solve. At the end of the long walk, Jon stepped into a hall of obsidian and shadow. She sat on the throne, Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons. Her silver hair fell like silk over her shoulders, and her eyes burned with intensity. Beside her stood Tyrion Lannister, and a few steps away, Missandei and Ser Jorah Mormont. Jon bowed as a small nod. No kneeling, not yet. You've come a long way, Jon Snow, Daenerys said. Her voice was calm, measured. Or should I say, Targaryen. The word echoed loud, final. Jon's eyes didn't flicker. I didn't come for names. Tyrion stepped forward, his tone softer. We know who your mother was. Lyanna, we know what Rhaegar did. The truth has been buried long, but Varys found it. Samwell Tarly confirmed it. You're not a bastard, Jon. You're Aegon Targaryen. Jon didn't speak. He didn't care about titles. Not anymore. Not after everything he'd seen. I came because the dead are moving, he said. And if we waste time arguing about crowns, there won't be a realm left to rule. Daenerys watched him carefully. So you don't want the throne? Jon laughed bitterly, for the first time in days. I'd burn it myself if it meant saving the living. Something in her shifted then. She stood, walked toward him. I've seen kings beg for power. I've seen lords lie for it. You're the first man with blood of fire in his veins who doesn't even want it. I want to stop the Night King. Daenerys nodded. Then we fight together. And just like that, two dragons met, not in fire, not in fury, but in purpose. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Jon showed them dragonglass buried beneath Dragonstone. Daenerys offered ships, soldiers, fire. He trained with her men. He taught them how to fight the dead. Ghosts stalked the cliffs while Drogon circled the skies. There was tension, always, but it wasn't fear. It was the weight of prophecy pressing down on them both. And then the Raven came. From Winterfell. The wall has fallen. The Night King rides a dragon. The North burns. Jon read it without breathing. He had been too late. They sailed before the moon rose. Daenerys flew ahead, her dragons screaming across the sky. Jon stood at the prow of the ship, wind cutting through him, fury building like a storm. When they reached Winterfell, it was worse than the letter had said. The gates were broken. Snow drifted through the halls. Blood stained the stone. Sansa had survived, barely. Arya had vanished into the woods. Bran had changed. His eyes now saw too much, too far, like he was no longer just a boy. "You have to face him," Bran said to Jon. "It was always meant to be you." The final stand came at the Godswood. Snow fell like ash. The Night King approached on the back of an undead dragon, wings rotting, fire turned blue. His army stretched behind him, an ocean of corpses. Jon faced him alone. Daenerys circled above, raining fire, but it could not touch the Night King. He dismounted, walked slowly, calm, eyes locked on Jon. They met among the old trees, ice and fire. And when the Night King raised his hand, Jon did not run. He raised the black steel blade he had taken from the crypt, and it burned in his hand, and not with heat but light, not just dragonglass, Valyrian fire. They clashed, steel on frost, flame against shadow. Jon moved like fury made flesh, not with grace, but with purpose. The Night King struck with inhuman speed, but Jon met him. Because he wasn't just a Stark, and he wasn't just a Targaryen. He was both. The sword bit deep into the Night King's chest, and for the first time the blue eyes widened. Cracks spread across his body like glass shattering. And then, silence. The Night King exploded into a storm of ice and screams, and all across the battlefield the dead collapsed. When the sun rose, the survivors stood in silence. Fires burned low. Dragons circled above. Sansa walked through the blood-soaked snow and found Jon still standing among the Godswood trees, his blade buried in the frozen earth. "You killed him," she whispered. "No," Jon said, eyes distant. "I ended something, but I don't know what begins now." Later, when the lords met and begged him to take the throne, Jon said nothing. Because the boy who once wanted to belong, the bastard of Winterfell, was gone. Now there stood only the man the fire and ice had made. Not a king, not a prince. A reckoning. Winterfell had never known such silence. Not even after war. Not after fire. Not after snow. The silence that followed the death of the Night King was different. It was not mourning, it was a pause. Like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what Jon Snow would choose next. Sansa ruled the north in the meantime. Her hair tied back, her face harder than it had ever been, but her heart still northern, and still loyal to her family. Arya never returned. Some said she sailed west. Some said she walked the wind like a ghost. Bran remained at Winterfell too, though he was no longer Bran in truth. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was of strange things, doors that weren't there, timelines that nearly were. And Jon, he stayed away from the halls. He spent his days in the crypt, often sitting before Ned Stark's tomb, as if waiting for an answer that never came. The truth of his blood had spread. Rhaegar and Lyanna's child, Aegon Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne. But Jon had never felt further from the crown. He had seen what kingship did to men, what war did to the realm. He didn't want it, but the realm wanted him. Ravens came daily. From dawn, we pledge our banners to the true king. From the Riverlands, we've bled for wolves before. We'll bleed again. From what remained of the south, bend the knee and we'll call you king. From Dragonstone, come, sit the throne that is your birthright. Daenerys wrote that last one herself, not with fire or fury, but with understanding. You have seen what I've seen, fought what I've fought. You're more dragon than I ever was. But maybe that's why you must rule, because you don't want to. Jon stared at the letter for hours. He burned it in the hearth without replying. One night, he walked the Godswood alone, snow falling gently through the red leaves. Ghost was beside him, as always, calm now. No more growling at the wind. There were no more dead to fear. Sansa found him there. "They'll never stop," she said. "They'll keep calling for you until you answer. You could unite them. You could stop the game before it begins again." Jon said nothing. She stood beside him. "You're not just a Stark, Jon, and you're not just a Targaryen. You're the only thing left in this realm that the people trust." He turned toward her, then eyes tired. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" She didn't argue. A week later, before the banners could march north, before the lords could crown him, Jon Snow vanished. No ceremony, no goodbyes. Not even a raven. He rode north of Winterfell, past the wall, past where the maps ended, past where men were meant to go. Some said he went searching for Arya. Some whispered that he went to guard the realms of men once more, not as a sworn brother, but as a watchman of his own choosing. The last line, always in shadow. Others believed he went where no man should walk, chasing whispers of something older than the Night King. Some say there are worse things beyond the Frostfangs. Some say Jon knew it, but the truth, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, did what no king ever could. He saved the world and gave it back. He walked into the cold, crownless, titleless, nameless, but free. A ghost in the snow, a legend in the north, a man who chose peace when he could have taken power. And the wind whispered his name for years after. Not as king, not as prince, but as the wolf who walked away.